Hi, friends. This is Steve at New Compass Crypto. Thank you for joining us. You can watch this video and all our other videos on our YouTube channel at newcompasscrypto.com or even via our website at newcompasscrypto.com. Today, we are going to talk about inflation. Inflation is the reason why everything is costing you more this year than it is last year. It is the reason why the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates, and it is the reason why any money that you have in the stock market or your retirement accounts is taking a beating this year. So who are the Federal Reserves and why are they raising interest rates? The Federal Reserve is made up of 12 different people. The only one you'll ever really hear of is the head of the Federal Reserve. Currently, he is Jerome Powell. He is known as Jay Powell. He has been on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve since 2008. In 2018, he was appointed by President Trump to be the head of the FOMC, and he was just reappointed to another four-year term in May of 2022 by President Biden. So he'll be the head of the Federal Reserve until 2026. Okay. But when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, they are not raising the rates of your student loans. They are not directly raising the rates of your auto loans. They are not directly raising the rates of your home mortgages. They are only doing one thing. They set the rates for what institutions, financial institutions such as banks, can loan each other for overnight loans when they have excess liquidity. That's pretty crazy. So all they're doing is setting the rate at which large banks, large financial institutions can lend each other money overnight. Yes, that is in fact all they are doing. But once they do that, especially once they begin raising that rate, for the last several years, the rate has been effectively zero. And now it's 3.25%, 3.5%. What happens is that the banks then begin to have a trickle-out effect to the rest of the economy. It does affect then your credit card companies. They then are going to raise your rates. It raises your mortgage rates. It raises your student loan rates. And it raises your auto rates. It all trickles. Nothing stays compact. For perspective, let me share a chart. Let me share a chart with you. Here, you can see the three important things. This is the Consumer Price Index all the way back since 1950. The Consumer Price Index is this blue line. The Consumer Price Index is inflation. You're going to then see the red line, which is the federal funds effective rate, the federal funds rate. And the third is the unemployment rate. Why is the unemployment rate there? Because the Federal Reserve has two mandates. The first mandate is price stability. Price stability meaning they don't want inflation to make prices do this all the time. And especially you don't want to make prices do this. The second mandate, though, is just as important, and it is maximum employment, meaning that they want the unemployment rate to be as low as humanly possible. I want you to only look at two parts of this for me. The first part is the federal funds rate when it was at its all-time high, which was in 1980. It was at 20% in the 1980s. Now, when the red line was at 20%, the Consumer Price Index, inflation, had reached 14%. It had been climbing all during the 1970s. During the 1970s, inflation got out of control because gas prices went through the roof, oil prices went through the roof, there were oil embargoes, and that affected the price of everything else. The Federal Reserve tried several things to bring it down. It tried raising rates moderately, And when that didn't work, they said, you know what? We are going to make it so painful. We're going to raise it to 20%. When it raises rates to 20%, it makes it incredibly difficult for the average person to get credit, because when it raises the rates to 20% to what institutions can charge each other overnight, remember the trickle-down effect. It has mortgage rates at that time became 19% on a 30-year mortgage. Auto loans went to 22%. So that meant that on your monthly payments every month, a huge chunk of what you were paying, especially in the initial part of a mortgage, was simply just interest. And it became crippling. The green line right here that we can see, unemployment, which had been actually fairly low during 1975, 1976, went then all the way up to 10%, 11%. It didn't top that again until right here during the Great Recession of 2009, 2010. And then, of course, during the pandemic when it briefly went to 20% again. For perspective, unemployment rates at these levels are historic. During the Great Depression of the 1920s, unemployment rate reached 20 to 25%, and it stayed there for about roughly 8, 9, 10 years. So the Federal Reserve could not have that. So it took and it made credit so hard to access. It took rates to 20%. And what happened to the unemployment rate? The unemployment rate, which had been at 10%, lo and behold, it dropped down to 5%. That's great. And then the blue line, the consumer price index, inflation, which had been at 14%, very quickly and very drastically dropped to 2.5%. So this method of simply taking credit and making it so hard to get and it bringing down prices, in fact, it works. When did it happen again? Well, what happened again is, if you look over here, during the recession of 2000, it started in 2007, but 2008, 2009, as you can see, the unemployment rate began to go back way, way back up again. Even though the consumer price index had really stayed around 5% and in fact fell, the unemployment rate had gone up, and it had gone up because banks had failed, institutions had made really bad decisions, and therefore the Federal Reserve did something actually counterintuitive, which is rather than taking the federal funds rate and going way, way, way back up like it did in the 1980s, it said, let's see what will happen if we take rates and we make them all the way down. So if unemployment is going up rather than if inflation is going up, we're going to make credit easier to get, far easier to get. And that is why it lowered the federal funds rate effectively to zero, and it stayed there for the next 5 years. And sure enough, as credit became more available, businesses began to flourish, and the unemployment rate dropped. It went all the way from 10%, and it went down to historic rates of 3.2, 3.3%. Those are historic rates, historically low rates, as you can see here. Then the pandemic came and unemployment skyrocketed. For brief days, brief weeks during the pandemic, it went back up to over 20%. And then again, the Federal Reserve took rates which had been hovering at around 2.5%, 3%, and it dropped them down to effectively zero. And sure enough, again, it worked. It worked one more time. The unemployment rate dropped, and right now it's sitting at 3.5, 3.7%. So again, the Fed is saying, wonderful, this works. But it had an unintended consequence. What was the unintended consequence? As you can see, we'll make this part of the graph a little bit bigger. The blue line, the consumer price index, chose not to behave. It went from almost zero in the early part of 2020, and it began to go way, way up throughout 2021 and 2022, and now it is at 8.1%. And therefore, the Federal Reserve is now playing catch up with this red line right over here on the right. Now the Federal Reserve has got to increase interest rates because inflation is going up just like it did in the 80s. Inflation went up in the 80s, and therefore you had to raise federal interest rates to get them down. So as inflation is going up in the blue line right here, right now the Federal Reserve is responding with the only tool in its tool belt and making interest rates rise to make inflation come down. That is how inflation works. It is, and that is how it affects the general markets. The Federal Reserve has a target rate of inflation being around 2%. It is currently 8.1%. So there's a gap in there. So it needs to keep on raising rates. This year, it has raised rates at historic rates. It went from effectively 0 to now over 3%. And still right now, unemployment is falling and is low. And prices haven't come down that much. Inflation, which was at 9.2%, 9.3% in June, have only fallen to about 8.1%. So they need to fall faster. And the Fed, if they don't fall faster, the Fed will have no choice but to keep on increasing rates. And as you saw, there have been times when rates are going to have to be increased to 20%. No one is expecting that to currently happen. Hopefully, a couple more interest rate hikes is all that will be required. When that happens, hopefully markets will stabilize and then it gradually begin to go back up. That is what inflation is. That is how it works with the Federal Reserve. Again, I am Steve at New Compass Crypto. Please subscribe and please like the videos if you like them, and we'll see you again next week. Take good care. Bye-bye.